Hey, welcome back to Everyday Economics. It's a podcast that helps you learn about the economic world happening around you every day. I'm your host, Chris Krug, president of 501c3 nonprofit Franklin Muse Foundation. Everyday Economics is a production of America's Talking Network. Check out all of our great podcasts at americastalking.com. To support Everyday Economics and podcasts such as this one, please make your tax-deductible charitable contributions by clicking the link in the show description. We're recording this episode on Wednesday, February 8th. And joining me as always, it's Dr. Orphe Divounguy. He's a PhD economist. State of the Union last night. Always kind of interesting to hear what the president has to say. Of course, as Americans, the president matters to all of us. And what comes out of his mouth. And of course, then the rebuttal, comes afterwards. It's always interesting as well. The tactics last night, setting politics aside, around economics. I want to just talk about what the president talked about economically last night.
Isn't it funny that every single president, I can't remember last time a president did not take credit for the good things in the economy and blame the previous president for all the bad things in the economy. And this is not just with the current president, it's every president. And so I just wanted to say that.
There's a structure to these kinds of speeches. There were some economic points there. And I'm not going to fact check President's State of the Union. That simply would just take too long. I'm going to draw it right from the summary article CNBC produced. And I thought Emma Kinery did a nice job with this. Wall Street Journal had a good takeaway. I'll try to pick some of those too. But, from a tonality standpoint, of course, the president was very upbeat on what's going on in the economy. And he did talk about unemployment, which is statistically at a near record rate. And he did talk about job growth, although the unemployment number and the job growth, when you talk about them as if they are directly connected, it's kind of disingenuous. But as Kinery says in her piece, that the president did talk about wanting to kind of reshape the economy. And how might that happen? Well, it would be through more taxes on the wealthier people. And he has said over and over again that if you make under $400,000 a year, that you're safe. So he's really going after the billionaires. But you and I have talked about that before. If you go after the billionaires, there's only a handful of them when it comes right down to it. And if you took every single penny away from the billionaires, it wouldn't resolve anything in the U.S. economy at all.
That is true. But I think he succeeded via the inflation tax, right? So we're in a moment where inflation, let me just rephrase that a little bit. Higher inflation has disproportionately hurt low-income families, and higher interest rates have also disproportionately hurt lower-income families. And so we have a problem, right? But before the Fed started raising interest rates, we have to understand that the labor market in the United States has not been in a better shape in terms of employment growth, wage growth. And so, yes, this president definitely can make the claim that today's labor market is putting a huge dent in U.S. inequality because wage growth is stronger at the bottom than at the top. If you look at the unemployment rate gaps, racial gaps, they've shrunk. By the way, it's Black History Month, so we got to plug that in here. The labor market gaps have shrunk tremendously. Workers have more bargaining power, although I think that's eroding now with all the big bosses asking workers to return to work. So, yeah, the labor market is still on solid footing, but this might come to an end. It might be short-lived because the Fed has to raise interest rates so much. It could eventually kind of put an end to this and send us into a recession. And of course, all of that would have been created by the large stimulus dollars that were injected into the economy. By the way, I shouldn't just say the stimulus dollars, right? There was some Fed policy lowering interest rates to support the economy and help us deal with COVID. But there was also massive injections and fiscal stimulus that pushed demand too far, kind of engineered the 9% 40-year high inflation problem that we faced in 2022. Again, I think it's very disingenuous for any president, not just the current one, to take credit for all of the good in the economy and then to pass the buck when it comes to all of the bad things that are happening in the economy. Presidents have almost no influence. Even the stimulus dollars was a bipartisan effort, if you want to call it that. It's a president and a Congress putting together these types of stimulus dollars. And so they share the blame for the 9% inflation and should share the credit for a labor market that has put a massive dent in U.S. inequality, employment and wage inequality in this country. And so that kind of gives you a picture of my thoughts on these types of speeches, which, by the way, are also riddled with inaccuracies. So, yeah, I stay out of the politics. I speak economics only. That's my language. And so I am just kind of summarizing it for our audience.
And that was actually a pretty terrific apolitical analysis. Catherine Lucy from Wall Street Journal, her story that she filed overnight or ahead of today's news cycle, pulled something out that I thought was kind of interesting. Despite, and this is her, quoting directly from her, despite Mr. Biden's efforts, the public is mostly frustrated with his management of the economy. A recent Washington Post ABC poll found that 58% of Americans disapproved of his handling of the economy. Only 37% approved. Now, we've seen that number before, and I'm going to be maybe a little sharper edged than you were, and without being too terribly political. I feel like when you're taking credit for things that are not happening, that's tantamount to gaslighting. And so if the suggestion is that the economy is better, that's great. I mean, you and I talk 3-4 times a week, and we're both concerned that there might still be a recession, that we just don't know. I guess I just don't share his optimism.
The economy is in good shape, but it's slowing rapidly, right? So that's kind of what the numbers show us, is that we still have a pretty strong economy, but it is slowing rapidly. We saw in the last quarter, inflation-adjusted final sales to domestic buyers were nearly flat, rising by only 0.8%. That consumer spending has slowed tremendously. Domestic spending has slowed. Credit card debt has increased by nearly 19% in quarter 4 of 2022 alone. And we're seeing, again, that basically the only bright spot in this kind of uncertain economic environment has been the labor market. And of course, the Fed is taking aim at the labor market. I think it's clear to most economists, at least, and people who study this, that monetary policy tools are blunt and difficult to use with a great deal of precision. And further rate increases could potentially push the U.S. economy into a harder landing. And that maybe it was really time for fiscal policy, for the government at all levels to step in and support the Fed in engineering a soft landing. We've talked about that on the podcast a few times. A little bit of help on the supply side, would bring down inflation while at the same time preventing further demand destruction, is kind of what we've said on this podcast again and again and again, right? Like the idea that we have such high rent growth in the United. We had such high rent growth. By the way, rents are finally falling. Inflation is decelerating rapidly. The fact that we had such high rent growth in this country is because of a pre-existing housing shortage. When we think about how we invest our tax dollars, I think housing policy should be a priority, because a rapidly rising housing costs are a risk to economic growth. They exacerbate wealth inequality, and wealth inequality costs the U.S. economy roughly $3 trillion per year on average. And I'm pulling this from a nice piece of research produced by the San Francisco Fed last year. If we're going to prioritize what's going to help grow our economy, it should be housing. It should be making sure that people are housed, that people have access to affordable housing, that people can move to places where the jobs are. Part of the reason we have massive labor shortages is that, you have service workers who can't afford to live where their jobs are, right? You even have now landlords that are choosing to house some of their workers, especially in these service jobs that are kind of lower paying jobs in this economy, in places where house prices have gone out of reach for most folks. And so housing should be a priority, but not everything else.
I like your thoughts. I appreciate them. For Orphe Divounguy, this has been Chris Krug. Subscribe to Everyday Economics and dozens of other quality podcasts at americastalking.com.